All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, part 2 of our interview with Jonathan Neville. Jonathan is a thought leader in the Heartland movement, primarily focused on Book of Mormon geography in the eastern United States. But there is a second flashpoint that this movement has, which is the translation of the Book of Mormon. How did this happen? For Jonathan and many others, all of the translation of the Book of Mormon was done with the Urim and Thummim. Most of academia now has moved to saying that most of it was actually done with a seer stone. And so between the seer stone and the Urim and Thummim is more the grand narrative at this point. Jonathan goes into some specifics on this, on why he believes it is just done through the Urim and Thummim based on certain accounts. Before we get into this episode is brought to you by the Gospel on the Nile tour. This is a tour that Bruce Porter and I are doing late September 2023. We are covering the pyramids of Egypt, the Sphinx. We're going down to Thebes/Luxor, which is where the papyrus of the Book of Abraham comes from. Edfu and the temples there, the Valley of the Kings and the temples, Nag Hammadi and the large cache of New Testament period writings. So all of this is based on both ancient and contemporary temples and bringing this together. It is a temple experience. You may not be able to learn more about the temple outside of the temple than actually going down the Nile and visiting some of these locations. This is an opportunity of a lifetime. It's a trip of a lifetime, and we would love to see you there. You can go to cwicmedia.com, CWICmedia.com, go up at the top navigation to trips and events, and then scroll down to Gospel on the Nile to find out more information. It is filling up fast. We've got about half of that cruise already filled up. All right, on to our show. All right, Jonathan, so on the translation, this is another flashpoint, really, that I would say. I mean, you've got the geography differences, that competing theories here, Mesoamerica and the Heartland hypothesis. But in addition, there's another flashpoint, and that's how was the Book of Mormon translated? And this seems to be another rebuttal outside of, again, I'll call it mainstream academia, on the origin and historicity of how the Book of Mormon came to be. And it comes down to, and there's been a couple books written on this now, it comes down to, did Joseph Smith use the Urim and Thummim, or did he use a peepstone, a seer stone, to translate the Book of Mormon? Now the narrative today is it's a seer stone.
Right. I know.
And it's really interesting. I'm going to get to this in a minute. When you get to the Gospel Topics essays on this, they don't support anything if you really read it closely. But here's what you had to say on this in terms of well, first of all, we need to bring this, before I make this quote, we need to talk about why is there a discrepancy with this? Why is it accepted that most of the Book of Mormon was translated with a seer stone and not the Urim and Thummim? How do we get to that point, and why originally was it thought that it was the Urim and Thummim that was used for that translation?
Well, boy, that's a long answer. I don't know how.
Let's roll. Let's do it.
Okay. The very first thing, of course, that Joseph Smith said about the translation was that when he got to harmony, he copied and translated the characters. That's right in Joseph Smith history. I think it's verse 62. And he receives the plates, takes them to Harmony, Pennsylvania, where he finally has some time to look at them and go through them. And he says, I copied the characters and translated them with the Urim and Thummim. So right there, you see he's learning the language. And he wasn't reading it off of a stone. He was copying the characters. That tells us he was learning the characters, right? Then the next thing we hear about it is really, there's not much of a record about it other than that he was translating with Oliver Cowdery. because Martin Harris's accounts all came later, chronologically. I mean, contemporaneously, we don't hear much about the translation, how it was done. As far as I know, the first published account of the translation was I think it was in September of 1829, right after the translation was finished. And there's a Palmyra paper and a Rochester paper, and they both said that Joseph put spectacles in a hat. And you immediately know that that's an impossibility, because Joseph had been commanded not to show the Urim and Thummim to anybody. So for someone to say he put the spectacles in the hat, they could not have been present when that occurred. So it's hearsay. It has to be.
Well, what
hearsay.
about the idea of the veil, though? Was he behind a veil?
Well, still, then
a curtain.
The point is, it wasn't being observed.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So someone assumed that he put spectacles in a hat because they couldn't have observed it. And when I look at this, I look at what Joseph Oliver said, and I say, well, why would they say certain things? Why did Joseph Smith, on a couple of occasions, make such a big deal that the Lord told him he'd be destroyed if he displayed the Urim and Thummim and the plates? Why did he have to say that? And I think the reason he had to say that was so that we would know that anybody who claimed they saw the spectacles was either lying or relying on hearsay or assumption or inference. So I have a model that I use for analyzing all these called the faith model. I've talked about in my upcoming book. And it starts with the F stands for the fact, and then inference, or facts, assumptions, inferences, and then your theory based on those things, and then your hypothesis going forward. That's the faith model. And when I say fact, I consider a fact as evidence of reality. So, for example, regarding getting back to the geography for a minute, Lucy Mack Smith's statement that Moroni told Joseph Smith that it was in the hill of Cumorah, it's a fact that she made the statement, but that isn't necessarily the reality, right? Mm-hmm. People can argue about that. And the reason people come out differently on the reality is because of the assumptions that they make and the inferences they make. And that's how the confirmation bias thing works. No matter what the fact is, you can apply a different analysis to reach your conclusion. And so when I read this newspaper account of Joseph Smith putting spectacles in a hat, when I look at that, it tells me, well, that's just hearsay or assumption, because it contradicts the narrative that Joseph gave us. And that's why he gave us that. So we would know anybody who claimed they saw the spectacles was not speaking from direct observation. And so I dismiss those as being hearsay or assumptions. Then we have the Mormonism Unveiled, published in 1834. And in there, they identified three specific explanations for the Book of Mormon. The first one was the peepstone in the hat. And the description they gave there is almost exactly what you read in the Interpreter, Book of Mormon Central, and the Gospel Topics essays. It's like they copied it out of Mormonism Unveiled. And then in the next paragraph, they say other people say that he used the Urim and Thummim from the Old Testament. But in neither case did he use the plates, is what Mormonism Unveiled says. And then, of course, the third one they give later on is the Spalding theory, that Joseph was behind a curtain, he had a manuscript, and he was just reading from the manuscript. So those are the three explanations that Mormonism Unveiled gave. In response to that, Oliver Cowdery wrote these 8 letters. And in the first one, he said, and this is the passage that's in the Pearl of Great Price as a note to Joseph Smith history. He said, Joseph Smith translated the record by means of the Urim and Thummim, or as the Nephites would have said, the interpreters. So right there, he refuted the peepstone thing, and he refuted the idea that he didn't use the plates. Right? His first response was that. Later on, Joseph Smith in the Elders Journal, I think it was 1838 or so, I can't remember the exact date, but he did a Q&A kind of a thing, and he said, where did the Book of Mormon come from? And he said, well, Moroni, a resurrected being, essentially gave me the plates and the Urim and Thummim by means of which I translated it. And then in the Wentworth letter, he said the same thing. He specified that he translated it by means of the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates. So he totally excluded any possibility of the peepstone. Both he and Oliver did. So then the question is, well, where'd the peepstone come from, right? There were rumors about it, obviously, in the Mormonism Unveiled, as well as in those first articles in 1829 when they said they put spectacle in a hat. Maybe they had heard it was a stone in a hat, and the reporter thought it was a spectacle. It's impossible to determine what he had in mind. But this idea of putting something in a hat and reading it was originated right there in 1829, right?
So you bring up here you bring up something. Well, this is what you call the demonstration hypothesis.
Yeah.
Right. So explain that just a little bit.
Okay. So, well, let me say let me back up first before I get into that, because you asked where the peepstone thing arose.
Yes.
So based on the Mormonism Unveiled theory, the peepstone in the hat, and what Joseph and Oliver, when they refuted it, they didn't come right out and say, we did not use a peepstone. They just said, we used the one that came with the plates. Okay. So you kind of have to take it a little, and they also discredited Mormonism Unveiled entirely anyway. But
now,
later
on this, there are secondhand accounts, is what they're looking at in academia then, that says that a peepstone was used. But you're saying, again, going back to Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith, their words are it was translated by, well, they either used the power of God or the Urim and Thummim.
Well, they said the gift and power of God with the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates. Okay. So, and this is a key point that the academics use. Even in the Gospel Topics essay, they don't even quote Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. They quote everybody else. Mm-hmm. And they say Joseph said it was by the gift and power of God, and they truncate the whole quotation to omit the part about the Urim and Thummim. It's unbelievable when you look at it. Huh. And it's the same. They did that in the Saints book. Same thing, exact same thing. So the only way you find out what Joseph and Oliver actually said is you have to look in the footnote, look up the reference, and then read the whole statement. But the Gospel Topics essay, Saints book, the academics, Rustone Rolling and all that, they never quote what Joseph and Oliver actually said in full and in context.
Interesting.
Because when you read that, it obviously refutes the stone in the hat. So instead, they rely on what Martin Harris arguably said, although usually he said he used the Urim and Thummim. But actually, there's a whole lot of detail of this. It's in a new book coming out this week from me and a co-author, Jim Lucas. And we go through all these statements of Martin Harris, not Lucy.
What's the name of the book?
Emma Smith. It's called By Means of the Urim and Thummim. And the subtitle is Restoring Translation to the Restoration. Because we think it was translated, because
no, that's an interesting point. I'm going to get to that. Let me insert a quote here. I know I'm just interrupting you a little bit here, but this is from the Gospel Essays topic page on LDS.org or churchofjesuschrist.org. Right. It says Latter-day Saints later understood let me back up. These two instruments, it says, the interpreters and the seer stone, were apparently interchangeable and worked in much the same way, such that in the course of time, Joseph Smith and his associates often used the term Urim and Thummim to refer to the single stone as well as the interpreters. Is there anything from Joseph Smith specifically or Oliver Cowdery where they are using the seer stone that he had and call it an interpreter?
No, that's that. And I've analyzed that Gospel Topics essay in a lot of detail in some of my blogs and books, because it's entirely misleading the way they write that. And what happened is later on, Joseph did, and we have the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants that refer to everybody getting a stone and being a Urim and Thummim and all that. The earth is the Urim and Thummim. So the words were used interchangeably then. But I think that's partly because of how Jonathan Edwards talked about the Urim and Thummim, if you want to get into that. But the statements from Joseph and Oliver were unequivocal that he used the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates. He didn't use it from some stone he found in a well. And Orson Pratt made the statement that the Urim and Thummim was created by God. It was not a natural object. And so it isn't some stone that we have in the archive up in Salt Lake somewhere. That's just a natural object. The reason this is, well, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, the reason this is so important, some people say, well, what difference does it make if it was a stone?
That was my next question.
Okay, that's the logical next question. Well, it gets down to two things. One is the credibility of Joseph and Oliver, because they said it was the stone or the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates. And when Moroni came, he said this was prepared by God for the translation. In the Book of Mormon, in Ether, it says, here's the two stones that God prepared for the translation. So all of that narrative is superfluous if all he needed was a stone he found in a well. So
that's the natural question. It's just like, why is the Urim and Thummim being given if he could have just used the Seer stone?
Yeah.
What's the point of it? I mean, there's description of it. It's massive. It's the two triangles. There's a lot of description about this whole thing.
Right. Well, and it was especially prepared and preserved and enclosed with the abridged plates, the whole thing. And that narrative just kind of disintegrates when you say he didn't use the plates and he didn't use the Urim and Thummim. I was at Education Week a few years ago in that theater, in the Varsity Theater, they called it. And we had a guy, I don't want to say his name, but he was a church history expert, let's say. And he was talking about how Joseph Smith used the Urim or the stone in the hat. And he said at one point, Joseph Smith said that the title page came from the last leaf of the plates, but we don't know how he knew that because he wasn't even using the plates. That's how ridiculous this whole thing is. Okay. How about he knew that because he was translating the plates as an alternative, they don't even consider that anymore. And so I've heard the narrative too, that when Joseph said he was copying the characters and translating them, that's when he was trying to do it on his own, but then he realized he couldn't do it, so he used the Seer stone instead. Which, you see stuff like that, and you think, well, how do you reach that conclusion?
So you're going back to the same point, though, of why the geography matters.
Yeah,
is the same you're saying here for why what the understanding of the translation of the Book of Mormon matters.
Yeah.
And that is that because we need to believe what Joseph Smith said.
Yeah.
Do you think that people make that connection, though? I mean, is that...
Some do. I mean, to me, it's such an obvious connection. The only way it gets lost is with the sophistry of these scholars that try to obscure it, obfuscate the whole thing. But it's such a clear delineation between what Joseph and Oliver said versus what they're trying to say. Now, to get back to your point about the demonstration. So here's how this all panned out for me. Early on, I wrote a book called about the two sets of plates, whatever happened to the golden plates. I don't know if you're familiar with that, where I'm saying not. That. Okay, I'll summarize it real quickly. When Joseph got the plates out of the stone box that Moroni prepared, those were the abridged plates, the abridged record, plus Moroni added. And the title page says in there, the abridgment of Nephi, abridgment of the record of the Jaredites, and then Moroni sealed it, meaning Moroni added his own commentary at the end, right?
And an actual seal.
Yeah. So that was what was in there. Joseph took those plates to Harmony, translated the first part, which is the Book of Lehi, which he said, by the way, the first part he took from the Book of Lehi. So it wasn't from a stone. He took it from the plates. Then those were lost. Oliver Cowdery came down. They translated the rest of it all the way to the title page. And then they said, well, they were wondering among themselves, should we go back and retranslate the Book of Lehi? And that's in when the Lord told them in D&C 10, don't go back and retranslate that. Instead, you have to translate the plates of Nephi. But the key is he didn't have the plates of Nephi at that point. All he had were the abridged plates. And so before he left Harmony, he gave those plates to a messenger. And because and Lucy, his mother, wrote about this. Okay. So let me finish it, then you can ask questions.
Yeah, no, I'm just, there's something triggering in my mind here, but keep going.
Well, and what might be triggered in your mind is D&C 9, because the Lord told Oliver Cowdery that when he tried to translate and couldn't, he said, continue with this work, and then I have additional records for you to help Joseph translate.
Yes.
And the very next section of the Doctrine and Covenants, D&C 10, tells what those additional records were, and those were the plates of Nephi. And so Joseph gave these records, the abridged plates, to the messenger. Messenger took them to the hill Cumorah. And on the way is where David Whitmer passed him on the wagon and said, "Do you want to ride?" And the guy says, "No, I'm going to Cumorah." And David Whitmer said, "That's the first time I ever heard the word Cumorah. I didn't even know what it meant." And then later he realized Joseph told him it was one of the three Nephites, right? And so the messenger went to the hill Cumorah, to where the repository was, got the plates of Nephi and took those to Fayette, which is why Joseph translated those in Fayette. And we know that because on the very first part of First Nephi, we have the writing of John and Christian Whitmer, who were never in harmony. So that had to be translated in Fayette. First Nephi through the Words of Mormon was translated in Fayette. So those were the plates of Nephi that the Lord told Joseph he'd have to translate in D&C 10. So there, in that way, there are two completely different sets of plates. And that's
now where does Martin Harris take the characters to Anton here?
Right.
Is he doing that while he's scribing?
Well, no, it's before he was scribing. He went down to see Joseph, and Joseph had copied these characters and translated them. Martin Harris apparently took that document with him, first to see Luther Bradish up in Albany, and then down to New York.
Well, this is before the translation process happens.
Yeah, well,
but there are three sets of characters that Martin Harris takes.
Well, we're not sure what he took, because I'm
pretty sure there's three sets of characters.
Okay. No one knows because there's different accounts of what he took.
Okay.
Because we have the characters document, right?
Yeah, but that's not the real one.
That's not the real one. The real one had a translation with it, which we don't have. But it wasn't Bradish. It wasn't Mitchell. It was the other one. Who's the other one he went to see? The scholar?
Anthon. Yeah.
Anthon said they were like zodiac characters and looked like a Mayan calendar, but different.
Yeah, that's concentric circles and.
Yeah, but he said that a few years later when he was giving information to Mormonism Unveiled guys. So, I mean, that's not how Martin Harris or or Joseph Smith described the characters.
Okay. So I just a little tangent there. So get back to what you were saying. So.
Yeah. Okay, so there were these two different sets of plates. And that's why when the 8 witnesses saw the plates and they handled them, none of them said there was any sealed portion, right? And even Joseph's mother said that the plates that Joseph showed to the 8 witnesses he got from the messenger. He didn't say he got them from the stone box. And that's why, in my view, he showed them the plates of Nephi. And Joseph's father said he weighed them and they weighed 30 pounds. But the other people who held the abridged plate said they weighed 60 pounds. So the critics have said, well, this all made up because they can't even agree on what the plates weighed and how big they were and all that. Well, it's because there were two different sets of plates. And that's why, Joseph Smith said.
Why does that matter?
Well, it matters because it gets back to Cumorah, for one thing, because that is another evidence that the repository was in the hill Cumorah, like Oliver said. But it matters even more because it means Joseph did translate the plates.
When you say repository, you mean beyond the stone box?
Yeah. It's a separate part of the hill.
Yeah.
But if Joseph wasn't really translating the plates, then it didn't matter if there were two different sets. In fact, if all he was doing was reading words off of stone, D&C 10 makes no sense. Because the Lord said, you have to translate the engravings on the plates of Nephi. Well, how would he even know if it wasn't using the plates?
But the idea of the narrative today in LDS scholarship is translation means something much more vague than what you're describing.
I know.
You're saying and I've adopted this, right? So it's like, so you're saying that translation is what it means.
Yeah.
You're saying he's looking at the characters through the Urim and Thummim,
Yep.
and it's being given through the Urim and Thummim which is the original thought, right?
Right.
And then he's dictating this to his several scribes, right?
Yeah.
So the question that comes up with that oftentimes is the idea of the JST, the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. Well, what does he translate? Right? He's not going from one language to another. The characters are trying to interpret what the characters mean. He's inserting things, and where's he getting that from? It's not.
Yeah.
He's not using the translation specifically of the Bible in the same way. It's more of a, as people would say, it's like a trigger.
Okay.
For the
how did the translation of the Bible originate?
Well, my understanding is from him reading the Bible. Where he's with the Book of Mormon. He's having. No, okay, go ahead. You tell me.
Well, the very first part of it is what we call today the Book of Moses, right?
Yeah.
And that's not anywhere from the Bible. It has nothing to do with the Bible. But if you read in Ether, Moroni said that whoever gets these plates, he says, I'm not going to start with the history of the world from the beginning because that record is held among the Jews. And whoever gets these plates can have access to that. Right? Mm-hmm. So what I think happened, this is just my own personal opinion, I think when Joseph finished the translation of the plates, he gave the bridge plates to the messenger who took him to Cumorah. Then he got the plates of Nephi, and he and Oliver returned those to the repository in Cumorah. That's why Oliver said they went in there and there were stacks of records everywhere and all that, right? I think he had access, like Moroni said he would, to that original early history of human race or whatever. And
from the repository?
From the repository. He said they were in there. Moroni said you would have access to them, right? And so I think he did have access, and I think he was translating that first part of the Book of Moses from the record that was in the repository. That's what I think. That's why it started off as a translation of the Bible. And then later, he sent Oliver Cowdery on a mission. He started having John Whitmer as his scribe. He had already started it as a translation. That's why it was a translation of the Bible. It wasn't technically the Bible. It was Moses' account. And then it continued on into him going through the King James and kind of making the changes in the margin, the Clark commentary and all that stuff. But so it carried on as a translation, but it started as a translation, is what I think.
So the Book of Moses is also the stick of Judah, or a stick of Joseph.
No, it was from the.
Well, it's got a Josephian source.
Okay. Well, all I know is Moroni said he had access to the record. Whatever stick it's from, I don't know.
I the way I look at all that is the brass plates is part of the stick of Judah, because I think that's the origin, the tradition.
That could be.
My point is from the brass plates, or just any of the records that might have been.
Whatever Moroni was referring to, whether it was Ether's writings or the brass plates, whatever. He didn't really specify. But so I think in other words, I think the translation of the Bible started actually as a translation using the Urim and Thummim. And then when they had to leave New York and Oliver Cowdery left and all that, he couldn't continue with that because he had to leave the records there. Now, that leads into an interesting little anecdote, too, about, well, where are the plates today, right? And I wrote about that in that book about whatever happened to the golden plates, because I think, Oliver Cowdery said that, and David Whitmer said the plates are no longer in the Hill Cumorah. David Whitmer was specifically asked about this. And they said, well, where are the plates now? And he said, they're in New York. And they said, are they in Cumorah? And he says, no, but they're not far from there. And those adventurers in Rochester will never find them. That's what David Whitmer said. And he also said that Oliver Cowdery had told him about going into the repository.
Let me ask you a quick question here. So the first set of plates being the Book of Lehi, at least, that they had.
The abridged plates.
The abridged plates, okay, from Mormon. Those were returned to the messenger.
Mm-hmm.
Then they got the small. Then they got the small plates.
Right.
And the small plates they held on to. Those are the plates you're talking about. The small plates that were not returned to the messenger.
Right.
Okay.
Well, the small plates, okay, the messenger took the small plates over to Fayette. So Joseph had them there.
Yes.
He went to Palmyra, showed them to the 8 witnesses, and then he and Oliver took them back to the repository. Because that's one thing that was always kind of confusing in church history. When Brigham Young talked about Oliver going to the repository twice, at least, why were they going there? Well, one reason was to return the plates, the small plates of Nephi, that we call them. The other, in my view, was to have access to these other records that Moroni referred to, so Joseph could start the translation of the Bible. Now, if you look in the Pearl of Great Price, it says a vision given to Joseph Smith, and whether it was a vision that he wrote down or it was a translation, but they called it a vision. They were trying to de-emphasize the hill Cumorah because they didn't want people going and digging up the records. And that's why, in my view, when Brigham Young talked about how many records were in there, he said several wagon loads. I think he knew it was several wagon loads because Joseph and Oliver and Joseph's brothers moved all those records back to the hill Shin. That's what I think happened. And that's why David Whitmer said they were no longer in the hill Cumorah, but they weren't far from there. And that's why Oliver Cowdery said they were no longer in the hill Cumorah.
Okay, and did I confuse Shem and Shiloh before?
I don't know, because Shiloh, no, I don't think so, because Shem was Amaron's hill.
Okay, that's right. Okay, yeah. So it's not going back to, it's not Shiloh, it's Shem.
No, it's not Shiloh, it's Shem.
Okay, which is where? Is that Tennessee?
Well, somewhere, no. Okay. It's most likely in upstate New York, west of Cumorah, but not far from there, according to David Whitmer. Which makes sense. It wouldn't be that far. I mean,
so based on what you're saying and what you're interpreting through church history here, the all and it's probably beyond records, right? I mean, is the Sword of Laban there? Is the Leahona there? Is the whatever else would have been in that repository? Sure. All of the Josephite emblems, would be there. Those are all somewhere in upstate Western New York.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Well, this is another funny thing because back before they took down the visitor center in Salt Lake, they had a diorama of this. Mm-hmm. They showed the 2 different hill Cumorahs. I don't know if you've seen that. If you remember that one. They had 2 Cumorahs right in the visitor center, and I took pictures of it, showing how ridiculous the whole thing was. They have Mormon down in Central America with abridging his records. They have Moroni up in the north in New York, and with him he has the Sword of Laban and the Leahona and the plates, and he's putting these all into this stone box. It's just that Oliver and Joseph forgot to mention when Joseph opened this stone. He forgot to mention there was a sword and a Leahona there. I mean, it's just so ridiculous. But that's what they were showing because they had to, because in D&C 17, the Lord said they'd have a view of the Sword of Laban and the brass plates and the Leahona. Well, how could that happen unless they were in the stone box? Because otherwise they'd have to be down in Mexico in the real hill Cumorah. Whereas when you real hill, they're in New York all along, as Oliver Cowdery explained. That's where the Sword of Laban and Leahona and all that other stuff was too. So it was pretty easy for the witnesses to see all that stuff. It was right there present, but it wasn't in the stone box.
So what does academia have to say about the Seer stone then in a rebuttal to what you're saying? What are they saying?
Well, they rely on David Whitmer and Emma, the last testimony of Emma. They rely on one obscure statement of Martin Harris's. And then I think it was Oliver Cowdery's wife who made a statement along those lines that corroborates it. And so that's what they rely on, primarily David Whitmer. I mean, basically, they're relying on Mormonism Unveiled. The 2 main sources are Mormonism Unveiled, which they quote almost verbatim, and David Whitmer's last message to believers in Christ. Those are the 2 primary ones they quote. And we already know what Joseph thought of Mormonism Unveiled. He denounced it as a bunch of lies. And yet that's what they're using. And then David Whitmer I mean, this is another example. I shouldn't laugh because it's a serious matter, but the way they approach it is so ridiculous. It just drives me nuts because they'll say, okay, you have this whole long diatribe from David Whitmer about how terrible Joseph Smith was and a fallen prophet and all that. But at the very beginning, he talks about the stone in the hat. So that part's true, but the rest of it's all false. I mean, yeah, you can play that game, but it doesn't make any sense. And then the other thing, well, let me back up. You asked about the demonstration theory.
Mm-hmm.
So let me explain that real quickly. So confronted with this discrepancy between what Joseph and Oliver said and what everybody else said, there are a couple of solutions that have been proposed. One is this idea that when Joseph and Oliver said Urim and Thummim, they meant the one that came with the plates as well as the seer stone. And that's just not historical. I mean, Mormonism Unveiled made that distinction crystal clear between the peepstone and the Urim and Thummim. It was two separate ideas. And that was before any of this later Nauvoo stuff arose. We're commingling the terms. So to me, that's just an imaginary resolution that doesn't work. Another resolution is to say that everybody who talked about the peepstone was just a liar. And that's kind of what the Stoddards have done in their book, Hannah Stoddard and James Stoddard. They said, well, they're all liars. Joseph never used this seer stone for translating the Book of Mormon. And okay, that's an alternative. I mean, to me, that's not that credible because I think partly because of the early account, the very first account was that he put spectacles in a hat. That had to come from somewhere. So people were talking about it right after the translation was finished. Mm-hmm. And I also, just based on my experience as a lawyer, and doing trials and stuff, people generally will have some scintilla of truth in their testimony, even when they're lying through their teeth. It's based on something. And so I don't think this idea of a stone in a hat just arose out of thin air or was a satanic, implant or something. I think people actually saw Joseph put a stone in a hat and dictate words. Now, the question is, what was he doing? Was he translating the Book of Mormon? Well, if he was, not a single one of those people, Emma, David Whitmer, none of them said what Joseph actually dictated on those occasions. They didn't say, yeah, I was there and he dictated what is now First Nephi chapter 2. None of them said that. All they said was that he was translating the Book of Mormon. And so to me, that's a pretty strong indication that whatever they saw, they had to make an inference or an assumption that it was a translation. What I think happened is Joseph, there was a lot of pressure in the farmhouse in Fayette because they had Joseph and Oliver were translating upstairs. They had a maid who was working there, and she freaked out because when they came from downstairs, they were like glowing, and she wanted to know what was going on, and she was going to quit if they didn't tell her what happened. The whole family was under all this extra stress of caring for them, Joseph and Oliver, and everybody was dying of curiosity. And I think Joseph just decided one day to show them how it was happening, but he couldn't show them because he couldn't show the plates of the Urim and Thummim. So he said, it's like this. And he put a stone in there. And let's say what I think personally is that he quoted Isaiah from memory. And I've explained all the reasons why in one of my books. Mm-hmm. And then they said, oh, he's translating the Book of Mormon. But he wasn't really translating the Book of Mormon. He was quoting Isaiah, those Isaiah chapters. And so that led them, because they were assuming he was doing a translation, they all remembered that, and they talked about that as how he did it, even though he was really translating it upstairs. In fact, even John Whitmer, who was one of the scribes, said that he used the plates and the breastplate and the Urim and Thummim when he was doing the translation, which I came across that. I don't remember having read that anywhere else, but he did say that. And this guy named Gurley was our LDS historian guy. He went around interviewing everybody he could. And his conclusion was that Joseph used the stone, and I think the phrase he used, to satisfy the awful curiosity of his followers. But he never showed the place to anybody except for Oliver Cowdery, possibly, which makes sense because Oliver tried to translate.
Mm-hmm.
So when I saw Gurley saying that he used the stone to satisfy the curiosity of his followers, the awful curiosity of his followers, to me, that was the explanation right there. He did a demonstration, satisfy their curiosity so they leave him alone so he could do the translation. Even David Whitmer said that they worked from morning until sunset, which in New York is like 14 hours a day. And he said he wasn't present for most of it, but he kind of knew how it happened. And the one specific instance he offered was they set up the table downstairs. If you've been to the Whitmer home there, you know there's a big downstairs open area. Set up the table. Everybody was sitting around it. Joseph put the stone in the hat and dictated words. So to me, that looks like a demonstration. I mean, why would he want everybody around when he was actually doing the translation? Doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I came up with this demonstration hypothesis. Of course, my critics at Interpreter think now I'm saying Joseph Smith misled everybody and deceived everybody, when I'm saying no, it's just the opposite. He was satisfying their curiosity. If they wanted to infer that it was the translation, he refuted that by explaining, no, I translated it with the Urim and Thummim. It came with the plates, not with some stone I found somewhere. And then the other little piece of evidence that they use is he said when he was done with the translation, he gave the stone to Oliver. Emma had made a little pouch for it that was on display, and he gave it to Oliver and said, I don't need it anymore. And so the historians say, well, that's because he was finished with the translation. And I'm saying, no, he didn't need it anymore because he didn't need to use it as a demonstration anymore.
Yeah. So the demonstration hypothesis then is basically it allows for, yes, he did. People saw him with a hat. There's some nugget of truth there,
right?
But it's not the instrumentality of the translation.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason this is important, besides the credibility of Joseph and Oliver vis-a-vis the others, is that the narrative of having plates compiled, first of all, recorded for 1,000 years, and second, abridged, and then concealed in what Orson Pratt said was a separate department of the Hill from where the repository was. All of that, and then the Urim and Thummim being specially prepared, handed down for generations and so on. That entire narrative evaporates if all he did was read it off a stone. And then it becomes an occult kind of a thing where you could argue, well, who put the words on the stone, right? You get into all the issues of, like Royal Skousen insists that it was a tight control, right? And that Joseph only read the words that are on there. Well, that doesn't explain why Joseph was justified making all the changes later. But if he was a translator, of course, when he learned better grammar, he could fix the grammar that he translated. There's all the passages in there. It says, or in other words. To me, that's evidence of a translation, not of Mormon making a mistake when he was writing. And there's that same phrase, in other words, appears throughout the Doctrine and Covenants. It's one of the non-biblical Book of Mormon phrases that I've written about, So to me, all that's evidence of translation. And then the Hebraic parallel structures and so on that would be preserved in translation because they were in the original and Joseph was translating it as he went. And so they're in there. Some of them are imperfect because of the translation, but the structure is still there.
Which to me goes right along the lines of actually, I believe, why the Isaiah chapters are written the way they are. You're explaining exactly in my mind why the Isaiah chapters are similar to what we find in the King James Version.
Yeah.
There's a reason that structure has to stay in place, I think.
Yeah.
This is great. I really appreciate your time, Jonathan. We're going to need to revisit a couple of these issues, maybe a little deeper dives in a couple of these things. I do find it interesting that as I have studied, some of this history, you don't find a lot of what you are writing about. You don't find a lot about the repository and the plates being exchanged and all these different things. Those things are kind of off to the side typically. Yeah. And it's, you kind of ask yourself, well, why? Why is this? Where is that history? And why aren't we talking about it?
It's your spiral of silence problem. It really is, because the scholars don't like me to even talk about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They feel like I should be ignored. And Jack Welch, I've even brought this, for example. I don't know if I have it here, but he did that book, Opening the Heavens.
Mm-hmm.
And he deliberately changed the history to omit that messenger taking the abridged plates to Cumorah. Supposedly that's a compilation of all the authentic accounts. No, he edited it to omit
It's just so odd that the actual one linchpin of it's not just the geography as you're explaining, it's also the translation is ignored.
I know it.
That is really odd to me because it's almost like there's so much that's already nebulous. Why are we trying to put this cloud around this over here also?
Well, I think what I suspect, and no one's articulated this. In fact, early on when I got into this, I wrote a book rebutting it. No one's made the argument, so I haven't published the book. But it's the idea of Dan Vogel's thing about the Indian origins of the Book of Mormon.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that Jack Welch, John Sorensen, Dan Peterson, those guys are so obsessed with Mesoamerica because they are afraid that people will assume Joseph Smith adopted the mound builder myth. And that's all he did, that he composed it. And it was based on the mound builder myth, view of the Hebrews.
Yeah, because that was something that was going on back then. I mean, that was that kind of talk was happening in those days.
Yeah. And I have a whole response to that, but there's no point in getting into the response until someone makes the argument. So,
that makes sense.
But one last thing on the translation,
yes.
And this is really interesting because my co-author and I kind of went through this in a ton of detail in this book. But one of the things that we concluded was that the Urim and Thummim acted as sort of a literal translator, where it would give you the exact words, but it's not grammatically correct and doesn't really make sense in English. So the translator has to go through and convert it into his own vocabulary using his own syntax and so on. And that makes a ton of sense to me. And an analogy is with the Rosetta Stone. If you look at the literal translation of the Rosetta Stone, it doesn't really make sense. So you have to put it into a European language or whatever. And that's why Joseph Smith was able to say that the title page is a literal translation of the last leaf of the plates. And he knew it was a literal translation because he didn't change it from what the Urim and Thummim gave him. And if you read the title page, it does read a little differently than the rest of the Book of Mormon. It's an interesting topic, but it's the only thing he said was a literal translation, was the title page. But he would know it was literal because he read it right off the stone the way it was, where the rest he had to translate.
Yeah, makes sense.
So it's awesome.
Jonathan, again, thanks so much. Let's get you back on the program. We'll talk about a few more of these very juicy historical points.
Okay, great. Good to be with you.
Thanks so much.